The Inner Chamber, written and read by Christopher Halton. For somewhat more than 20 years I have pursued, though I fear with little to show for it, the persistent traditions of a subterranean complex said to lie beneath the Suffolk village of Oxcroft. The structure, if it ever existed, is alleged to have belonged to a modest preceptory of the Knights Templar, suppressed like so many others in the unhappy events of 1307. The difficulty, as ever, lies in the absence of documentation. No charter naming Oxcroft survives. No episcopal register makes explicit mention of a house there. Yet a curious lacuna appears in the land transfers of 1312 to 14, when properties in the vicinity passed into hospitaller hands. Something was there. Of that I am reasonably persuaded, though whether it was more than a grange attached to a larger commandery must remain uncertain. More elusive still are the rumours attaching to what certain local informants, not without reluctance, have styled the Ordo interior. One encounters the name nowhere in recognised Templar statutes. It appears only in much later marginalia and in an 18th century transcript of doubtful fidelity. Nevertheless, the phrase's persistence is noteworthy. According to these accounts, this inner body acted as custodians of a certain object acquired, so the story runs during the Eastern campaigns. The descriptions are curiously consistent. A small flattened stone of dull grey aspect, faintly veined, and in darkness, said to exhibit a weak and uncertain luminosity as of moonlight caught beneath water. The powers attributed to it are, I need scarcely say, improbable. It was believed to confer upon those properly disposed an unusual clarity of judgment, an inward sight, to use the expression of a 15th century annotator whose manuscript I examined at Bury some years ago. Yet the same source asserts that those lacking the requisite spiritual fitness could not endure its contact. Tremors, agitation, and in one instance described only as furor, are recorded. I have found no material evidence of such a stone, nor, despite several discreet inquiries and one abortive excavation following drainage works in 1909, have I located the supposed chambers beneath Oxcroft. A fragment of work stair was, I am told, briefly exposed before subsiding into clay. No formal record was made. It is possible, indeed probable, that the entire matter rests upon the imaginative embroidery of later centuries. And yet, there remains the singular fact that references to the stones, sparse though they are, occur in manuscripts separated by time and provenance. That coincidence, if coincidence it be, has prevented me from abandoning the inquiry altogether. So powerful was the reputation attaching to what certain ecclesiastical authorities later styled a lost relic, that inquiries, it is said, were pursued even under direct papal instruction. These investigations, if the French depositions of 1308 are to be credited, yielded nothing. Several members of the order, subjected to interrogations of a severity we need not rehearse here, maintained either ignorance or silence. That silence has, in subsequent centuries, been interpreted both as guilt and as fidelity. For my own part, I claim no special qualification beyond persistence. I am Ralph Madden, formerly of King's College, a medievalist by training and inclination, whose interest in the Oxcroft tradition has not, I regret to say, enhanced my standing among more practical colleagues. It has been suggested, not always kindly, that I have mistaken local folklore for historical substance. The criticism is not without foundation. Yet a recent development obliges me to proceed. In the autumn of last year I came into possession of a packet of letters bequeathed to me from the estate of the late Dr. Henry Olwyn Carruthers, whose death removed from Suffolk antiquarian circles a figure of uncommon diligence. Among these papers, what most of them trifling, was a brief memorandum, undated but written in Carruthers' unmistakable hand, in which he advances a conjecture I confess would once have caused me to dismiss the entire affair. He suggests that the so-called stone, if it existed, may not have been of terrestrial origin. The memorandum cites, somewhat elliptically, accounts of a meteoric fall observed in the Levant in the year 1080, described in a Syriac chronicle as a rain of burning iron over the environs of Jerusalem. Carruthers notes that certain crusading contingents passing through the region decades later record the recovery of unusual stones of great weight and curious aspect. The connection is speculative, indeed tenuous, yet he proposes that an object of meteoric composition containing elements unfamiliar to medieval observers might well have given rise to impressions of luminosity or physiological disturbance. One must tread carefully here. It is established that certain meteoric ions possess magnetic properties and contain traces of nickel unknown in common terrestrial stone. It is not inconceivable that prolonged handling of such a specimen, particularly if associated with sulfurous or metallic compounds, could produce effects upon susceptible individuals. Whether these effects were interpreted as spiritual discernment by some and derangement by others is another matter. I would not at present assert that the Oxcroft stone was extraterrestrial. I merely observe that the possibility has been raised by a man not given to fantasy, and that this hypothesis, improbable though it sounds, accounts for certain features of the legend more economically than the supposition of supernatural agency. That said, there remains one detail in Carruthers' notes which I have thus far withheld. He states quite plainly that he believed he had identified the entrance to the Oxcroft chambers. The situation of this supposed access is, at first sight, unremarkable. It lies beneath a 16th century timber-framed dwelling erected, according to local survey, upon the earlier fabric of what may once have been the preceptory guardhouse chapel. The house stands a little apart from the village proper, where the road bends toward low meadowland, and the soil remains persistently damp in winter. The property has not prospered. Its history, so far as I have been able to reconstruct it from parish records and recent conveyances, is marked by a curious pattern of short tenancies and abrupt departures. Owners have changed hands with unusual frequency. Occupants, when questioned, speak vaguely of discomfort, of disturbed sleep, of a feeling which none care to define. I do not place undue reliance upon such testimony. Rural imagination is a vigorous force. Nevertheless, the house was presently unoccupied. I was able, without excessive difficulty, to acquire the property from a neighbouring farmer who had purchased it for the accommodation of seasonal labourers. The arrangement proved short-lived. Within weeks, he informed me, the men refused to remain there under any inducement. Their objections, though earnestly expressed, lacked coherence. The farmer himself, a practical and unromantic individual, confessed only that he was relieved to be rid of the place. It seemed to me, perhaps unwisely, that if the tradition of the stone possessed any foundation at all, its influence might account for such disturbances. The recurrence of brief occupations, each ending in inexplicable aversion, suggested proximity to something not altogether inert. I therefore sought the assistance of a former pupil of mine, Mr. Jeremy Montgomery, whose academic interests inclined towards medieval material culture, and whose temperament, I believed, would prove steady under circumstances less congenial than the seminar room. Though he had not completed his formal degree, a circumstance he attributed to unfortunate timing rather than deficiency, he retained a keen and practical intelligence which I valued. His enthusiasm for the Oxcroft tradition was immediate and, I confess, infectious. I therefore resolved to render the house habitable, at least to a degree sufficient for orderly observation. A modest quantity of furniture was introduced. Beds were made serviceable. The kitchen range was coaxed into operation, and certain elementary conveniences were installed. My intention was not comfort but duration. If the property possessed any peculiar influence, it would best reveal itself under conditions approaching normal occupation. Jeremy, being both younger and more practical, undertook much of the physical survey. Several sections of warped flooring in the rear parlour were lifted, revealing irregular brickwork from an earlier period beneath them. In one corner, the substructure appeared markedly older than the house itself, the mortar friable and of a composition unlike the 16th century fabric above it. We recorded measurements and temporarily replaced the boards, intending to resume excavation once suitable tools had been obtained. It was on our first night in residence that the house ceased to be merely inconvenient and became, I must choose the word carefully, attentive. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by what I at first took to be the distant murmur of conversation. The sound was subdued, rhythmic, and possessed of a tonal quality not unlike liturgical recitation heard from beyond a stone wall. I cannot say that I distinguished words, rather there was the impression of cadence without articulation. Within moments, Jeremy knocked upon my door, having experienced, as he later described it, an identical disturbance. Simultaneously, and this I recalled with reluctance, there appeared in my chamber a faint luminosity insufficient to illuminate the room, yet distinct against the darkness. It did not emanate from a defined source. Rather, it seemed to gather in the air itself, low to the floor and near the hearth, before dissipating gradually as mist dissolves under rising light. Jeremy reports a similar phenomenon in his own room, though in his case the glow appeared closer to the doorway. We conducted an immediate search of the premises, lantern in hand. Every room was examined, the exterior perimeter surveyed, the meadow beyond inspected as far as the gate. No person was encountered. The chanting, if such it may be termed, continued at the same subdued pitch, regardless of our position within the house. It neither intensified nor diminished, nor could it be localized. It seemed not to occupy space in the ordinary sense. After some 20 minutes, the sound ceased entirely. The silence that followed was complete. Jeremy, though undeniably unsettled by the disturbance, recovered himself with commendable speed. Indeed, before dawn, he had already begun to enumerate possible causes: atmospheric electricity, distant labourers at prayer, some peculiarity of resonance within the substructure of the house. His tone, though measured, betrayed a degree of professional excitement, which I confess I did not wholly share. For my own part, I found myself singularly ill-equipped to account for what we had witnessed. The lights had possessed no defined origin, the sound no ascertainable direction. Neither corresponded to any known mechanical agency, nor to any natural phenomenon with which I am acquainted. The experience resisted classification, and it was this resistance, more than the occurrence itself, which disturbed me. I hesitate to record what follows, and do so only in the interest of completeness. There was, during the brief persistence of the luminosity, an impression, fleeting yet insistent, that the manifestation was not merely incidental to our presence, but in some manner responsive to it. I do not suggest intention, still less awareness. The thought presented itself unbidden, and I dismissed it as an indulgence of imagination heightened by circumstance. Nevertheless, the quality of the light, its manner of gathering and dispersing, conveyed less the appearance of a mechanical discharge than of something tentative, as though, if one may permit the expression, an enquiry were being conducted. I am aware of how this must read. Jeremy, when I ventured the observation in cautious terms, smiled, not unkindly, and suggested that fatigue is an adept dramatist. I accepted the rebuke, yet I note that he did not entirely rule out the possibility. We returned at the first paling of the eastern sky to our respective chambers. Fatigue more than alarm governed us, and I determined that a few hours' rest might restore proportion to events, which in the small hours had seemed unduly vivid. Sleep, when it came, was neither prolonged nor wholly restorative, yet by late morning we found ourselves composed and, I must admit, animated by a renewed sense of purpose. The occurrences of the night, however disconcerting, had imparted to our investigation a direction previously lacking. Jeremy observed, not without a certain eagerness, that disturbances of such regularity might well indicate proximity to the object of our search. After a modest breakfast, we resumed the underfloor examination of the ground level. The rear parlour, where the brickwork beneath the boards appeared anomalous, became the focus of our attention. Several additional planks were removed with care, revealing an expanse of stone courses laid at an angle inconsistent with the visible foundations of the house above. The air rising from the exposed cavity possessed a faint metallic quality, not strong yet perceptible when one knelt close to the aperture. Jeremy remarked upon it independently, which reassured me that the sensation was not singular. Upon clearing debris from the northern edge of the space, we encountered what appears to be the upper curve of a dressed stone arch, partially obscured by later infill. The workmanship differs markedly from the overhead Tudor timber framing. It suggests, if I do not misjudge the profile, a late 12th or early 13th century origin. At this stage, our earlier nocturnal impressions receded somewhat in urgency. We were, it seemed, at last confronting something tangible, a structural fact rather than a rumour. That the disturbances should have preceded this discovery struck Jeremy as encouraging. I was less certain. There was about the stonework a density, an impression not of age alone, but of compression, as though the chamber below had not been merely abandoned, but deliberately burdened. We agreed to enlarge the opening after luncheon. We resumed our labours shortly after the noon hour, and continued without interruption well into the declining light of the afternoon. The February sun, languid and of little warmth, slipped below the meadow line unnoticed by us. Our attention was wholly absorbed by the steady removal of compacted soil and fractured brick, shovel by shovel, barrow by barrow. Gradually the arch's curvature emerged in full profile. The masonry, once cleared, revealed itself to be of a quality far superior to the surrounding infill. The stones were closely jointed and dressed with care, their arroses scarcely worn. At the base of the arch, embedded firmly within its frame, stood a door. It was of heavy oak construction and secured by broad strapwork hinges, deeply corroded but intact. The ironwork bore a repeated device, a stylized boar's head of distinctly early 13th century character, a motif I have encountered in ecclesiastical fittings of that period. The workmanship alone would have sufficed to place the structure within the later years of the Templar occupation. Yet it was not the antiquity of the door that arrested us. It was its condition. Despite having lain concealed beneath earth and debris for what must amount to 6 centuries, the timber exhibited no discernible rot. There was no warping, no fungal bloom, no softness beneath the pressure of the hand. The surface remained dry, unnaturally so, and retained beneath the grime the faint sheen of old oiling. The iron studs, arranged in a defensive grid such as one might expect upon a medieval strongbox, were firm in their sockets and free from the deep scaling one associates with prolonged burial. Jeremy examined the lower hinge closely and expressed what I had not yet voiced. The door appeared less excavated than uncovered. I knelt and placed my palm against the wood. It was neither cold nor warm, but possessed a curious neutrality of temperature, as though insulated from the surrounding soil by some agency I could not name. For several moments we stood without speaking. The air about the arch had altered. The metallic trace we had earlier detected was now unmistakable, faint yet persistent, and accompanied by a sensation difficult to describe, not of movement but of expectancy. It seemed absurd, though the thought may be, that the barrier before us had not decayed, because it had not been permitted to do so. The temperature within the exposed aperture differed markedly from that of the house above. Indeed, the cold was not merely perceptible but concentrated, a contained chill such as one encounters upon opening the door of a modern refrigerating chamber. The comparison is inelegant but exact. Our breath did not mist, yet the skin of the hands prickled, and there persisted in the air a faint metallic tang, accompanied by what I can only describe as a sensation of suspended electricity. It was Jeremy who first observed, and with some surprise, that the door possessed no visible lock, keyhole, or external fastening of any description. The hinges were intact, the frame was seamless, yet there existed no obvious means by which the door had ever been secured. We placed our shoulders against it and applied steady pressure. It did not yield. The resistance was not that of obstruction from within, nor of swollen timber against its jamb. It was absolute. The door might have been carved from the surrounding masonry for all the movement it afforded. There followed, and I confess this with some reluctance, a period of exertion unworthy of sober investigators. Fatigue and anticipation, I think, conspired to overcome caution. We applied leverage with iron bars, we struck the panels with the flat of a spade, we attempted to prise the hinges free. Jeremy, in a moment of impatience, took an axe to the lower section of the door. The blow rang, not dully as oak should under impact, but with a curious clarity, as though metal lay concealed beneath the grain. When we paused to inspect the surface, lantern held close, we found no indentation, no splintering, no fracture in the iron studwork, not so much as a superficial scar upon the timber. Jeremy ran his fingers slowly across the panel and withdrew them without comment. I examined the head of the axe. The edge bore a minute nick. The door bore none. We desisted shortly thereafter, more from a sense of futility than exhaustion. It had become evident that the barrier resisted us not by strength alone, but by some property inconsistent with its apparent composition. And yet there remained no mechanism to account for it. We withdrew to the kitchen, more from instinct than resolution, and set water upon the range. The ordinary business of preparing tea restored, for a short interval, the proportions of the world. Jeremy spoke at length about soil compression, mineral accretion, and the possibility of concealed internal bracing within the door's construction. I listened, though I suspect neither of us was persuaded by the theories advanced. We had, I think, reached the point at which explanation becomes repetition. It was at that juncture, the kettle not yet boiling, that we heard it. The sound was faint yet distinct in its character, a metallic movement deliberate and sustained, not the fall of debris nor the shift of stone, but the drawn scrape of iron upon iron. We froze. The sound resolved itself into what can only be described as the sliding withdrawal of a bolt. It was followed, after a pause long enough to allow doubt, by the slow complaint of hinges bearing weight for the first time in centuries. Jeremy set down his cup without drinking. "The door," he said quietly, "has opened." The sentence required no completion. We armed ourselves with our electric torches, a pitiful modernity in that depth of stone, and made our way once more into the exposed cavity beneath the parlour floor. The air altered perceptibly as we descended. The cold had deepened, though the house above remained temperate. A heaviness had entered the atmosphere, not odour at first, but density, as though air long undisturbed had begun to circulate. When our lights fell upon the arch, we halted. The door stood partially ajar. No more than 6 inches separated it from the frame, yet that narrow black interval possessed a depth wholly disproportionate to its width. From within there issued a smell, not sharp nor recent, but ancient. a dry enclosed corruption such as one encounters in crypts where stone has sealed organic matter beyond its proper term. There was beneath it a faint metallic undertone. Jeremy advanced a single pace. The hinges did not move. The opening had not widened. Yet from that slender aperture there came unmistakably the slow exhalation of air. Not wind, not draught, but breath. I placed my hand upon the edge of the door and applied the gentlest pressure. It yielded at once. The movement was effortless, so much so that the resistance of earlier hours seemed retrospectively absurd. The hinges turned without protest, and the door swung inward upon a darkness so complete that for a moment it appeared not as space, but as substance. At that instant a rush of air issued forth with surprising force. It struck us bodily, not violently, yet with sufficient vigour to compel a step backwards. The lantern flame guttered and expired. Our electric torches flickered but held. The exhalation ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Silence resumed. We directed our beams into the interior. The chamber beyond was no crude cavity, but a constructed undercroft of considerable refinement. 4 pillars of dressed stone supported shallow vaulting, their ribs meeting in understated bosses of undecorated form. The proportions were regular, approximately 20 feet square by my estimation, and the masonry, though ancient, exhibited none of the subsidence one might expect after such long concealment. The floor was of flagstone lightly dusted, yet otherwise undisturbed. At the precise centre of the chamber stood a table. It was of heavy monastic character, trestled and broad, fashioned from darkened oak whose surface bore the polish of long handling. It was not ornamental. It was functional. Upon it rested the stone. I recognized it at once. Though no illustration had survived, the descriptions I had examined across so many scattered manuscripts were sufficiently consistent to render doubt improbable. It was small, scarcely larger than the span of a man's palm, flattened and of a muted grey hue traversed by faint metallic veining. It emitted no light in the ordinary sense, yet it was not entirely dark. There persisted about it a quality difficult to articulate, not luminosity precisely, but the suggestion of withheld light, as though its surface retained some residual capacity for reflection in the absence of a source. Jeremy spoke my name. I realized only then that I had stepped across the threshold without conscious decision. The air in the chamber was colder than the air outside, and utterly still. It was at this juncture that I committed an act of singular imprudence. I placed my hand upon the stone. There was no interval between contact and consequence. An impression, vast, immediate, and wholly unendurable, passed through me. I do not speak of vision in the ordinary sense. Rather, it was as though comprehension itself had been forced upon the mind, without sequence or mercy. There was no time within it, no before, no after. Then nothing. When consciousness returned, I was lying upon the flagstones of the chamber. The cold had intensified. My head throbbed with a dull and interior ache, and my right hand burned as though it had been pressed against heated iron. A faint oil lamp guttered upon the central table, though I have no recollection of lighting it, and in its failing light I saw Jeremy. He lay a short distance from me on his side. For several moments I did not comprehend what I was observing. His posture was unnatural, not collapsed but arranged, as though motion had been interrupted rather than concluded. His eyes were open. The floor about him was dark. When I attempted to rise, my hand slipped. Only then did I perceive the extent of the stain. I will not attempt a full account of his condition. It is sufficient to say that his body bore multiple incisions of a character inconsistent with accident. The wounds were clean and deliberate, such as might be inflicted by a heavy sharpened blade wielded with purpose. There was no weapon present. The chamber showed no sign of struggle. The dust upon the flags was disturbed only where we ourselves had moved, and the table at the centre was empty. The stone was no longer there. The oil lamp expired. I was left in darkness, listening to my own breathing. With unsteady fingers, I located my electric torch and restored its beam. The light travelled slowly across the flagstones, where earlier the surface had lain beneath a fine, undisturbed film of dust, so even that we had remarked upon it, there now existed interruption. Footprints. They were sharply defined, each impression complete and unmistakable. The dust had not been merely displaced, but pressed down, as though by weight considerable and deliberate. The stride was measured, the spacing regular. They did not approach the table, they began beside it. I directed the beam toward the threshold. The prints advanced in a straight line from the centre of the chamber to the open door. There were no corresponding returns. Near the third pillar, a flagstone bore a fresh fracture along its edge, a shallow chip as if struck by metal of some force. Dark matter had settled within the fissure and radiated outward in fine arcs across the surrounding floor. The pattern was not random. It suggested motion. Jeremy lay beyond it. I forced myself to examine the impressions more closely. They were not booted, nor were they bare in the ordinary human sense. The heel was elongated. The forepart is narrower than the proportion dictates. The toes, if such they were, left only the faintest suggestion of division. I became aware, with a clarity I would willingly have exchanged for ignorance, that the depth of the impressions exceeded what either Jeremy or I might reasonably have produced. The final print rested upon the stone threshold. Beyond that point, the dust resumed its unbroken surface. There were no marks in the soil of the excavation, nothing upon the earth above, nothing in the house. It was as though whatever had crossed the chamber had done so only within its bounds, and had no need to proceed further. The air had grown still again. Very slowly I became conscious that I was alone. I cannot give a coherent account of my departure from the chamber. I remember only an overwhelming impulse to escape the enclosed air of that place, and the necessity, immediate and practical, of summoning assistance. The village post office possessed a public telephone. I recall difficulty in forming sentences. The constable on duty required repetition before he grasped that there had been a death. The police arrived with commendable dispatch. I was instructed to remain outside the property while 2 officers entered to examine the house. I obeyed without protest. It did not occur to me at that moment that obedience might later be interpreted as a calculation. After some minutes, the senior officer emerged. He was a compact, military-looking man who introduced himself as Inspector Bates. "There is a body in there," he said evenly. "On the kitchen floor, multiple stab wounds. We have recovered a knife." I attempted to correct him. "It is below," I said, "in the chamber." He regarded me steadily. "There is no chamber." I recall laughing at that, not from humour, but from the absurdity of it. I began to describe the excavation, the arch, the table, and the stone. Inspector Bates permitted me to finish. "There is no excavation," he repeated. "The floorboards are intact." I was taken into custody shortly thereafter. At trial it was established that Jeremy Montgomery had no fixed residence, and had been known to assume academic affiliations that did not exist. The Crown advanced the view that I had suffered a delusional episode brought about by prolonged isolation and professional disappointment. The burn upon my palm was attributed to contact with a heated metal surface, possibly the kitchen range. No mention was made of undercrofts, no evidence of excavation was produced. The house has since been reoccupied. I am told the new tenants report no inconvenience. The medical gentlemen who examined me here at Broadmoor have been considerate. They listen patiently when I recount the matter. They assure me that the mind, under strain, is capable of constructing environments of remarkable coherence. It is possible they are correct. There is, however, one difficulty. Each morning I awaken to find a faint circular impression on my right palm, as though from prolonged pressure. It fades by noon. Yesterday, for the first time, it did not fade. The end.